Hello, Planet FunCon.
Yoo-hoo!
Excellent. Love the energy. Love the energy. Welcome to the Heroes We Need X-Men Diversity and Identity panel. So I'm Dr. Eric Wesselman. I'm a psychology professor at Illinois State University. I'm also a full-time nerd and a huge X-Universe fan. I love being able to hang out with like-minded nerds to talk about the things we enjoy. So I'm going to introduce each of my esteemed panelists. We'll start with my right, Celtic Honey. Celtic Honey is an LGBTQIA body-positive cosplayer and performer centered here in the QC area. Faye is lover of all things nerdy and performer with a diverse skill set, including Kung Fu, Neo-Burlesque, Nerdlesque, and Draglesque. So, welcome, Celtic Honey.
Yay! I can clap, but
And further right, we have Farhia Osman. Farhia is a school psychology doctoral student, fan of comics, including the X-Universe, and of finding ways to merge interests in psychology and popular culture. She has research interests in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and social justice, especially for young folks, as well as how as RPGs can provide opportunities for identity exploration. Please welcome Farhia. And then further right, last but certainly not least, Old Man Logan.
Old Man Logan.
So Dr. Scott Jordan. Scott is a professor, cognitive scientist, philosopher, and panel moderator. Dr. Jordan has diverse creative pursuits combining his love of philosophy, science, and popular culture. Most of these are curated on his YouTube channel, Dark Loops Productions. Please welcome Scott.
Hello, everyone. Thrilled to be here.
All right, so what we'll do first is I want to give each of my panelists time to kind of talk about a particular X character that they really enjoy and then tell us a little bit about why. So we're going to start with Celtic Honey.
Okay. So one of mine is, I did last year actually, is Mystique. Mystique is definitely one of my favorites because I love, one of my nicknames is Shapeshifter. And so I really enjoy that ability to be whatever, but also I love how she will take that opportunity to be herself, fights to be herself, mutant and proud. That's her main thing that she goes for. So no matter what, you be yourself and you fight to be yourself and your true self. And she will always strive to be in her natural form whenever she can, because why hide? There's nothing to be ashamed of. So I really enjoy Mystique. That's definitely my favorite character.
Excellent, thank you. So, Farhia?
So I am a person who got into X-Men through the movies, and really growing up and discovering the movies from a cousin. And as someone who enjoys Hugh Jackman a lot, I'm so sorry to Dr. Jordan, because I sat right in front because I was going to say Wolverine as a character that I really enjoy. And I think specifically, I gravitate towards characters that fill that father figure role. Especially to the different people that he does serve that role, both in the films, the TV shows, as well as the comics, and specifically think about Catherine Pride or Jubilee, and how he is able to hold that figure role of he gives them a lot of agency to make their own choices, and also recognizing they are people, and so I think that's where I think me enjoying Wolverine a lot, but I think as I talk a little bit to the other panelists, where as I get older, I see ways of, as someone who at first didn't really like Cyclops, but seeing the ways, especially in the comics, how I recognize I'm a little bit more like him than I first expected. So I think I'm drifting towards from Wolverine as my go-to favorite to perhaps maybe in a few years down the line it will be Cyclops.
That will be the final question of your dissertation defense, actually.
And there's nothing worse than when people outgrow you. You know what I'm saying? So I'm going to say Team Logan, kind of obvious. I think it's the best movie, Marvel movie ever. It's, of course, a contemporary remake of Shane, but the idea of can society respect its killers? And the answer is often no. And of course, this is why Shane has to leave, and this is why Logan ultimately leaves Malfunction. But I gotta say, man, X-Men 97 Magneto is badass, and How the Kind of Angst is an amazing scene, and I find myself Team Magneto, I'll be honest. And guys, I would never stab Magneto in the back. I have no clue. I thought they were writing something that made sense, but yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so actually, since you mentioned 97, there probably will come some spoilers up, so just fair warning. So you can, leave right now and go binge it and then come back. No.
I'm going to retract these if that's
for me, the X Universe is something that was the first comic that I really started following regularly when I was about 11, and then correspondingly about a year later was when the original animated series came out, and I was hooked, and have been ever since. I go back and forth between Nightcrawler and Cyclops. And I'll just pick one for now, but I often find, particularly the more that I read Cyclops, I really resonate with, if for no other reason than, I guess he's very lawful in the way that he's written, and very, very self-critical, and I see more of that in myself than I prefer sometimes. But he's a very interesting character to me as someone who studies belonging and identity. And you don't really get that in the animated versions of the live shows. So much of his characterization really is in his head that the comics is really where that comes out. And some of that might come up when we have a discussion here. But and also thank you for helping me with Team Cyclops.
I think as a person who I am the eldest of five, so I have 4 younger siblings, and seeing the grappling of having to feel like you have the responsibility of taking care of a family, and also recognizing that they, as they get older, they have their own personalities and can disagree with me. And then as someone who grew up as a rule follower, I think I idolized wanting to be like Wolverine, but then I was like, I am very much lawful.
Well, that lawfulness is something they play with in 97.
Yes.
Right? They really make him a little more chaotic good than lawful, right? Absolutely.
One of the things that I love about, asking you about the characters, I'm sure you probably had times you're like, okay, which character do I really want, right? Or you mentioned lawful, chaotic, etc. Humans, we're complex, right? And one of the nice things about the X universe is that there are so many characters who we can probably see aspects of ourselves in. That it's just fun to kind of resonate and play in that way. Are there other characters that maybe you found yourself connecting to that maybe surprised you initially?
Magneto. I mean, he's the obvious. I mean, honestly, the conversation between Charles and Magneto was basically a conversation in one mind for someone who's in charge, right? I mean, it gets expressed as a split character, but what to do, when to use violence, when to not use violence. That struggle is a struggle for any leader, particularly in the military, right? So Magneto was always there for me, but it was always Logan. But in 97, it's like, all right, yes, because some things have to end and never again. And what does it mean to say never again? And we don't want to talk about it, but it comes to violence. And that doesn't mean someone's pro-violence. It means that if a system's going to end, and violence is the only way to prevent it from ending, one should expect violence. It's not a mystery when groups become violent like that. So I appreciated the honesty. Yeah.
I love how they're taking the X-Men 97, it's such a weird trip because I grew up watching the original X-Men, and so it's watching that parallel universe thing, and it's just so trippy. And how they have approached X-Men 97, it's crazy, and it's just absolutely amazing to watch, and how they kind of correlated it, and how modern society would take that into play necessarily too, and how we would react to something like that. And so I really enjoy them taking that opportunity to put that together. It's fascinating for sure.
Particularly the animated series. I mean, I'm an age, I'm not gonna tell you what it is, but I was watching X-Men, the original cartoon series, in graduate school, and in the original run. And so at this point in my career, it's a real nice bookend to have 97 come out and have it grow up in much the same ways I feel I have, or at least changed. And it was weird. It almost feels like cosmic destiny that 97 came out now, just in terms of my own life, so absolutely.
Yeah, I've been very pleased that, I mean, the original show was always trying to push boundaries as much as standard broadcast standards and practices would allow. I've been very pleased that Disney, as far as we can tell, has pretty much let them kind of just go as, grown up as possible. I mean, I think I was watching the first few episodes with my kids, and my oldest is 13 and my youngest is 3, and it was actually the 2 younger ones who were really digging it at first. Then we hit the 3rd episode where they did Inferno, and everybody's like, oh, okay, no. And then after that, I'm glad I sort of watched it by myself or with my partner, and I remember episode 4. Those 4 right, Genosha?
I think I remember sending you an email being like, oh, what, like, I was just like, you don't need to respond, but what the F? Like,
yes,
afterwards,
yeah.
like, messaging you after you'd already seen it and being like, oh my gosh.
So it's like I caught Farhia and a couple of our grad student colleagues are also X fans, and I couldn't not talk about it the next day. So I was like, all right, have you seen it? Okay, no. Just beware. It's gonna be like half an hour, you're just gonna be numb, right? I mean,
It was so jarring, and like afterwards, I'm like, I'll admit, I cried. I was like, oh my god, what?
You had to sit back, take a breath.
It was heavy. Oh my gosh.
And then the way it wasn't just that moment, it was the triangle that built up, and then all of it kind of resolves that way. There's just no way to ever get it back. Right? It's just
to the audience who hasn't seen it, we're trying to avoid as much spoilers as possible because it really is like a...
Watch it, please.
Yes.
It's really, it's good. You don't even have to necessarily, it helps to watch like the original and have the nostalgia and know like the characters and everything. You're going to get a lot more out of it. But I enjoyed the watchability of you can still watch it and not necessarily know the original. So
Yeah.
it's still something that you can jump
That's
in
good
and
writing.
watch.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you don't have to know anything about X-Men per se. It helps for sure, and it'll definitely pull your heartstrings a lot harder. But it's a great series.
And what they're all sort of hitting on here, this idea of good writing, that you don't have to have all of the mythology behind it, right? What is it about these stories, these characters, that connect with us so easily and so powerfully?
Well, it's like you mentioned, that even with like Disney, they're allowing them to run with these characters and kind of push the line to what their comfort limits are as a Disney franchise now. But it's creating connectivity, and like you even said, like you pull towards the father figures type thing. There's something for everyone. Each of these characters are struggling with something to a certain degree, whether it's didn't have a father figure, had a very destructive childhood, or they had something like with growth that couldn't even touch anybody, or had to be isolated. Like there's so many different, from a psychology standpoint, it's one of the best shows to watch because there's so many things to dissect and take apart. And so there is something for everyone, and there is something, and most like shows and things should have that kind of plot anyway of you can connect with some character, but with X-Men specifically, because there's so many drastic upbringings and childhoods and people that come into their powers and their lives are turned upside down or whatever, there's something always in there, but it's so drastic that it can create that jarring, like, oh, that character, that is something that like triggered a memory or whatever of having that connection.
Yeah, I also think the fact that we're living in a streaming environment matters, because I suspect the show could have been written this well originally. It's just that the writers had to work for people who couldn't directly charge the consumer. You had to create a more average product to appeal to more people.
Yeah.
Where now the money doesn't, it goes directly to Disney, so so they know what their people want, what they'll pay for. I'll also say that it's older people like me with money who are going to pay to make sure that stuff gets made. All right, your money is your vote in this country, right? Your money is your vote, and what you watch is what gets made. So a lot of that stuff, I think it could have been written this well earlier. It's just there weren't outlets for that type of. This stuff's expensive, man. I mean, expensive, and so yeah, good for them.
I think like thinking from a writing perspective, there has been even like from like the anime series, yes, and then also like thinking about like the comics. There's good runs and then runs that have great writing, and then runs that have not as great. So it's just the aspect of like, I think overall, yes, 97 did a great job of like trying to instill some of like what the idea, like what they wanted to get out of it and how to like help communicate. But I think I'm gonna steal a quote from a different panel that I went to, but to thinking about like overall why the X-Men really resonate with just a very various amount of people thinking about just for a quote of like to be human is to be oppressed, and with the X-Men, regardless of I don't have mutant powers, but they're
Yes, you do. I know.
It's a secret. But thinking about how like the reason why it resonates so well is like seeing the oppression in a metaphor so viscerally, and like the aspect of I can relate to being a Black person, I can relate to all these different other marginalized identities that I have, and the ways of people are resonating with the X-Men and just different X characters because they are showcasing their marginalized identity through all the other identities they have, including they all share their mutant, the mutant gene. And like seeing the ways of this is such a showcase of like human identity in a way that regardless of the writing, people are still going to resonate because there have been some bad runs and people stick with it.
And they do know that the target audience for 97 is adult.
That's true.
Right, and they didn't know that when they were doing the original animated series. That was Saturday morning kids TV. So knowing that you're writing for adults matters.
Yeah, so because the original run, they were the one rule that the writers were trying. Well, their unwritten rule is not writing. They knew they were writing a kids show, but they didn't want to write down to kids. What they didn't perhaps expect from that is that the age demographic who were interested in it became multi-generational, right? And that now provides them the opportunity to write to that audience, and it's going to bring other folks along. I know as a younger person, I was 12 when it came out. I was just blown away by the adult material that was in there. I was also starting to watch anime at that time, and so aside from anime, the only other place that I could get more mature material was from the animated series. I do want to pivot a little bit to build from Farhia's point about these issues of diversity and identity, because when they first created the X-Men, mutant was meant to be code for any sort of marginalized group to be able to discuss oppression within the context of the comics code. Now, as time went on, the comics code got weaker and weaker, and writers got a little bit more comfortable sort of saying the quiet parts out loud, right? Claremont comes in and starts to talk a little bit more about gender identity issues, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, and they continue to just ramp it up until today. And they also provide them the opportunity to talk about the intersectionality of identities and prejudices, right? So they all may share the idea that we're all mutants, but depending upon who's writing, sometimes there are still these other identity tensions that are played out, which is wonderful conversation starters, right? So I know each of you in different ways are inspired by the X-Men and also interact with folks in different ways. We have educators, young adults, of emerging adults performing, right? You educated a lot of cons. Neurodiversity is one of the things you would like to talk about, if I remember correctly, or?
Yeah, I tend to touch on that when I do different things. I was mentioning is one of my booth neighbors, Levy Cosplay. They do a lot of panels on neurodivergency and variety of things. She's actually they are actually a counselor as well, and a bunch of stuff. But yeah, I tend to touch on neurodiversity when it comes to other panels that I do, and but my main platform is consent and also respecting pronouns, because I exist primarily in queer spaces with performing and in general, like my social circles. So I identify as pansexual, and most of my friends are not straight, quite frankly. And so it's very important to me to respect pronouns, identities, preferred names, and any number of those types of things. And so those are my focuses, and it's very important to me. And so that's going back to the many elements within X-Men. The movies too, I'll touch on Deadpool. And just like the two kids even, like showing that, like just being able to be open more about having queer dynamics has been wonderful to see, and it's being able to show that a lot more through the ages and things, and not have to be as quiet about it. So when it comes to marginalized communities, it's from a queer standpoint. And yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. And then other folks, how do you find the X universe playing into the work that you do?
Okay.
Formulate the words.
So,
I sprung the question on you, it's okay.
I think the X-Men and where it was in the comics, where it was in the original animated series, where it is now, it's diagnostic of things the United States, I would argue, could have done a bit more coherently. In other words, everyone's created equal didn't mean everyone when the document was written. And we're still struggling to make it about everyone. And the brutal irony of it is the people that wrote it believed that God existed in nature. And when you look at nature and when you look at the theory of evolution, evolution favors diversity. A group that has a bunch of different types within it is the group that's most likely to be able to confront context and deal with it in a way that helps that group maximize its survival. So for a group to oppress some of the potential expression in that group is ultimately evolutionary deselection. So the X-Men is like, it's great that we have it, and I love that we're talking about diversity. It's like, why the hell aren't we celebrating that every day? Why isn't there a national figure who's telling us we're at our best when we're different? And I see people celebrating diversity, but it's not an understanding that we're all better off when we're different. So I love the X-Men, and I love what it's doing. It's exposing people to things maybe they don't see in their daily lives, and therefore making them more comfortable with difference. But it's like, well, thanks for catching up. We've got work to do, and we need to be the most badass, diverse culture on the planet. And that's the 21st century culture. So that's how I talk about the X-Men.
I think so, kind of going back in the sense of the X-Men being a way to talk about identity, marginalization, as well as just the intersectionality of identity. As someone who works with young people and trying to use the work that I do as a school psychologist in training, and when working with people, yes, there is an understanding of I have these certain marginalized identities, but they going forward past that of, yes, you have these marginalized and dominant identities, but also how do these things interact, and how are the ways of your experience of being unique. And so utilizing the X-Men in ways to communicate or understand not only oppression, but the intersection and intersectionality of who you are and how you interact and exist in the world, because I think with young people, they can kind of understand it sometimes, like within the own world. But I am actually I'm in teaching right now for the summer at the Freedom School, and some students really, really love to read. Other students do not like to read at all. And so trying to figure out how I can teach and help instill the values of Freedom School, and understanding how the world that they exist in can be oppressive towards them, but in various different ways based on identities. I've been bringing comics actually to like as like things that they can read and in helping instill some of the values of not only the X-Men but other books that I love, that they like seeing the ways that things have made progress to talk about identity in such complex ways in the language not only for like adults but also for young children. So students who do not like to read, but I bring over a comic of like, this is reading, this is reading, this is one way, and they get excited about it. I think that's one way that I see it happening. And I love being able to like share with them, like, yeah, I'm gonna bring my X-Men comic, and like that's gonna be my reading time because we are going to both be reading that time. So I love being able to share work with kids, and also express to them like how it can be more than just a page and really trying to connect to their life. And that's one way I see it connecting, specifically the X-Men into their lives.
Yeah. I resonate with that too because I'm a psychology professor and most of my research is on belonging and social inclusion and exclusion and the various ways that happens. X-Men provides a wonderful platform to talk about that as we've been discussing. One of the things I also like about it though is because, I mean, yes, there's action, but so much of the X universe is family dynamics and friendships and the complexities that happen there. And so even if you don't share any of the categories of the characters, there's usually things in there that you can connect to. And most of my college students have not read comics. I'd say that when I finish a class, a third of them love it, a third of them are like, yeah, I probably won't read a comic again, but I'm glad I did. And the other third is like, well, I just wanted the grade. And I'm like, yeah, well, there you go, all right. But those are the 2/3. They really are just surprised at how much they can see their own lives, these things. And then part of that is by design. So I study a lot of need-based psychology. So the need for belonging, the need for self-esteem, the need for meaning, right? And all these things play out. And I know Scott and I have written on this too, the need for understanding that morality is complex. And most of these characters, I mean, they didn't choose to be heroes. They don't necessarily really want to be.
The only one discussing morality in '97 is Charles.
So tell me more about that.
No, I mean, Rogue is probably my second favorite character in '97 because she rogues out, right? And for reasons that aren't just about what happened, but they're also about all the other things that have happened the whole time up to that. And I thought that was brilliant. They're not talking about morality. So I love the fact that, I'm not going to spoil anything, but of course Charles and Magneto talk a lot, right? And you can decide if you're comfortable with where their conversation went. But you mentioned the complexity stuff. I think when we jump into the real light and darkness of complexity, and we find ourselves doing things we never imagined we'd do because we believed we were a certain type of person, we start talking a little less about right and wrong. In other words, when the pain comes to you, when the struggle comes to your life and your house, there are things that have to be maintained, and sometimes violence is part of that. I'm not trying to be pro-violence, y'all, but I don't want to post-hoc judge people that are struggling, is my point, right? They're having struggles I don't, I haven't. So anyway, yeah.
Well, and that's one of the key lessons, at least in social psychology, where we talk a lot about the power of the social situation and how when we're sitting in our comfortable seats or whatever outside of it, we think we might act a certain way or we should on other people, right? But when you're in it, now it changes, right? And that is that good, bad, otherwise. It's something that is a conversation that needs to be had, I argue. And shows like the X-Men or any sort of material that deals with that provide us a safe way to do that, getting past people's usual boundaries, like Marvel's Civil War, right? And which is really just an extension of the mutant registration act in the X universe. I remember I was co-teaching a class with Scott back in 2016, the primaries of 2016, and there was a lot going on then about discussions of freedom of information, and they started floating travel bans for individuals of certain marginalized groups. And we never once said that. We were talking about superhuman registration. And one of the students raised their hand and said, and this is kind of like Civil War. This is kind of like the X-Men. And at that point, I dropped my pen as if it were a mic, and I danced, and I said, yes. Well, let's take a couple moments to open up questions from the audience if you have any. Otherwise, we'll continue to riff.
Come on, let's have a conversation.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Thinking about all of you guys, especially those of you that mentioned talking about characters you resonate with and you're sharing your own favorite ones. Most of those relating to reflecting, seeing yourself in those characters and identity related. When thinking about diversity, how does characters you do not resonate with inform your perspective on diversity and inclusion? And if you have any examples within the X-universe.
Killmonger from Black Panther.
Yes, ma'am.
It's not someone that I am, but the way that that struggle was expressed through that character, you couldn't ignore it. It was brilliant, and even though words may have been used in our lives to express that sentiment, having him act it out, and then I guess the grace that came to him at the end was just, that's what good art's about. So again, yeah, it wasn't X-Men, sorry, but I couldn't not say that.
To think about with 97, specifically going back, I think a character that, like, not like me, did not really understand being Professor X and really thinking about Xavier as the idea of, like, how can you determine oppression when you were, and the morality of it when you were not there, and him not being there, and for the majority of the series, and then having the idea of him coming in and saying what is right and wrong to people who are experiencing a changing world, and really feeling like he is inserting himself in a way that doesn't feel right, or, like, I think really express I think it was a great display of why I've struggled with Xavier and the way that he thinks, acts, and such, because I feel like the 97 portrayal was, like, a great distillation of why I don't really relate to him in a way, and also don't understand where he is getting from in some senses. And I think thinking about the Magneto and Xavier being two sides of the, like, just a conversation in the mind, where I really resonate and see more about Magneto, especially when in 97, and going back to that, he was there and he was in that moment and on Earth for the majority of the series, and the aspect of you can't really forget the pain and experience and negate that, and I think with Xavier really feeling like it is someone who is having the dominant, someone who has the dominant identities, then sharing, this is what you should do as a person of experiencing pain. This is what you should feel like, this is how we should go about it. We should pick peace when you are not really granting peace. So I think that is one character does not relate to me, or I don't relate to, and also find trouble relating to also.
I have trouble relating to Xavier as well.
Yeah, I 100% agree, yeah, because it seems like they not included him just to include him or whatever, but like you said, how he acts, especially in that series, in general, he wants to be this father figure, providing a home for everybody and stuff, and he had his struggles, but it was nothing like Magneto. What Magneto went through in his childhood and everything. He developed powers, and yeah, he lost use of his legs, whatever. But yeah, it's hard to relate to him because his struggle or whatever is that he somehow had all as well versed on the comics of, like, all this wealth and everything to be able to provide this mansion and this home for everybody, and that's great, but feels like he, like you say, he doesn't fully know what, so to speak, in the trenches is, as far as those struggles of all the kids that he's brought in. doesn't feel like he's going to ever really fully relate. He can feel it, and he can mind read it, whatever, but it's not an equitability.
And I think that was like thinking about going into comics. So I recently finished the original Phoenix run, and where seeing the ways of why I've been respecting and liking, like growing in my respect and love and admiration of Scott and understanding where he's coming from. I think this is me riffing, not actually answering the question anymore, but seeing the ways Xavier wanting to hold on to control and him not allowing, I think seeing the ways like Scott really having been placed in the role of authority, but then the moment that Xavier is there, feeling like he doesn't trust him to have that power, doesn't trust him to lead, and respecting Scott in the aspect of like, he's like, no, like I recognize what we need to do, or I am the leader here, and I'm not being allowed to lead is a hard thing. So, yeah.
Very hard.
It's resonating with that. It just made me think, okay, because again, coming at this from a belonging perspective, I've always appreciated how these characters do relate as a family, oftentimes a found family, right? And thinking about, well, you know, my kids are young now, but eventually they're gonna grow up, right? And just thinking about my own dynamics with my parents now, they do their best to try and let me be, but there are still those moments where once a parent, always a parent, and maybe they don't always want to let me. And I know that that's eventually going to happen to me. I imagine that's a dynamic that lots of people have, whether we're talking about family or any other type of mentorship role. Right? You gotta let people spread their wings. I really, what I enjoy about a lot of different characters is even like the villains, the ones who maybe I don't resonate with a lot. I like the ones who are written to make you go, okay, I wouldn't do this, but I see where you're coming from, right? And this matters who writes, but I've started to really appreciate Madeline Pryor. I've started to really appreciate Emma Frost the more that I read, and to know where they're coming from. And so that's been fun for me.
I like that conversation about Charles. And not identifying with Charles. I'll say that 97 was written in a way that speaks to that, particularly in the final conversations. One of the things I've talked about recently, in the Department of Psychology at Illinois State University, we do a lot of equity, diversity, and inclusion work. And the work that we tend to do involves changing policy, as opposed to sitting in meetings and getting upset and figuring out whose guilt can become the loudest, which is quite often what happens in those meetings. And as you guys were talking about Xavier, he's got the money. He never goes into the low-level work of change. It's always these large-scale, macro, cognitive, and that's what I'll call self-gaslighting, right? You're gaslighting yourself into thinking you're doing something to change things when you're really just making sure you never get in the place where the change needs to happen. And if you look at the infrastructure of many American cities, it's built to, we can self-gaslight, that we're here for good reasons, when in fact we know exactly what's going on. So Charles is the ultimate cerebral gaslighter. That's a paper right there, man. Yeah, I gotta write that.
And I'm hopeful for the next seasons, because they seem to be setting up enough breadcrumbs to talk about how these characters can potentially grow more. That last episode or so, when Logan, Magneto, Xavier...
Don't say it.
I won't
it never
say
happened. It's not true.
Okay, well, they all cross some lines. And if they're going to go the way they do with the comics, that is going to involve some serious self-reflection. And so I hope that they have the space to do that. So come on, Disney, give a few more seasons.
Yeah.
I don't know, Inferno was one episode.
Well, you know, okay, yeah, they could use a couple episodes, but you know, I'm not paying the money to fund the development of the series. So we've got a few more minutes. Any more questions from the audience?
Let's have a conversation. Come on. What was your favorite part of 97? Spoiler zone's over.
I don't know, I've got one to go back to comics. Something just popped in my mind recently. When they relaunched X-Men prior to the Krakoa era.
Okay.
So we had, and I don't even remember who the artist was, X-Men Gold #1, and there was a lot of anti-Semitic and imagery and such in there that nobody saw on the publishing end of Marvel until the fandom came back to Marvel and said, hey, did you know that this is this, and so on and so forth. As a reader, and I came back to that, I went, that really hit me hard as this is not what this book is about. This is not, this should never have had any place in this kind of a book. And I was looking to see what your thoughts are, because it's definitely anti-inclusion, celebrating diversity is, and I appreciate that Marvel made swift action, and I do feel strongly that I know some people say you have to preserve the integrity of the artwork, but as Marvel's done, they take the stance of we've altered the artwork. You will not see that artwork in print again, and even the digitals have been altered, so that will not be there. And it's one of the few examples where I look at it and say, this was the right call. I can understand our purists, but this was the right call. So, do you guys have any context on that if you wanted to speak on that?
Kind of goes back to, well, I mean, yeah, like you said, they changed it and everything. But like with Disney and their older movies and things, I like that they put a disclaimer in front of those saying that they don't identify like the views now, and this was back then.
Holiday Inn.
Yeah. That one, there's like several, even like the cartoons and everything. And so, I almost, if it was you're talking about the older ones or the ones now, when that happened.
That was early 2010s?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Seeing, yeah, that was very much a no better during that period of time, but like the much older ones and things that you couldn't necessarily, like having that Disney disclaimer would have been something along those lines, that it was a much older period of preserving that history of this was a different time, that was not correct, but we need to learn from it, and we need to acknowledge that it existed, this was wrong.
Well, you brought that up. That's really good.
I think one thing, like seeing it every so often come up on like Twitter X discourse that always comes up when people bring up the screenshot of Kitty Pryde saying the N-word, but in one panel, and like how this was way back in one of the older runs of the idea that like that taken out of context is like, oh, this is why this character should be canceled and such, and the difference between that specific panel or those specific instances and the way that what was being communicated for that panel and her whole rest of the speech being distilled into, she said a slur, she should be canceled in a sense, even though she's a complex character. That feeling very different than anti-Semitic imagery in a 2010 run, and where I think there's like nuance in what quote unquote should be allowed in how you depict certain I don't know what it was. I'm like blanking on the specific context within X-Men Gold, but thinking about like the ways of older comics, older things given some sort of grace, or they are not given grace. And then the aspect of, well, what was the purpose of this, the imagery that does not serve purpose? Whereas like this was like, yeah, she said something, she said a slur, but also taking out all of that context, and what is the difference between context or just you are just displaying hate in a time where it could have been easily Googled, or it could have been easily understood as hate, and appreciating then not only the swift but thorough action, I would say, with, okay, well, we understand we messed up in this position, in this specific instance, and we are recognizing that this is no longer in par what we would like to showcase with the X-Men, or no longer expresses or feels like it fits into the theme of what we would like to communicate. I think that makes sense.
Yeah, well, here's another, consistent with that, there's another example where diversity matters. And what I mean is, comic books, movies, they're artifacts of culture. And some people are going to commit themselves to having the original so that we can look at what was being said then and how that's different from what we say now, instead of destroying it. At the same time, both exist, right? The Twitterverse is going to hate what it wants to hate, and archaeologists are going to do their work. So both of those things are going to persist. And that's, in other words, you and I want to take a deeper look at the context. A lot of people don't. Well, that's diversity, right? And I'm here for it. I mean, hate is going to hate. That's not going to change. And canceling and its ability to actually impact someone's livelihood indicates just how economically dependent these artworks are. In other words, our artwork in this country is private industry. It's not BBC from England, where social tax dollars are put into a pot that allows people to make culturally relevant stuff. People are making stuff that will make money. And there are some people who manage to get money to make something they want to make that's not necessarily commercial. But kind of understanding that, they're both going to be there, right? And like I said, I'm here for it. I'll do what I can to stop the hate, but I want the archaeological record available.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point of the fact of the aspect of all sorts of expression are going to have the culture that is there within being,
yes.
The bias is going to be there, and bias can be reflected in the expression that we create. And this being a moment of that just showcases how prevalent certain biases towards groups is in the society, that it completely did not, going through it being an artifact of the ways of our society being biased and being oppressive towards certain groups, and just an example of, wow, this is even unintentionally still biased towards those groups, kind of thing.
We are running about time here, so I would like to give each of the panelists a chance to tell you where they can find you here and or online. So we'll start at the far end. Scott?
First of all, can we get a round of applause for Dr. Wesselman for organizing and moderating the event? Thank you so much. Actually thrilled to be here. I often cosplay Professor Edward Elric from Full Metal Alchemist. I'm not doing it today because it's an X-Men panel. But as part of my Professor Edward Elric cosplay, I'm writing a book called Your Truth. Anybody that knows Full Metal Alchemist knows that every person has their own portal to the truth. So if you'd like to write your truth in my book when we're finished here, please let me know, and there's a pen attached to it. As Eric said, I do a thing on YouTube called Dark Loops Productions, where we have these kind of conversations, usually about pop culture phenomena. Right now, we're podcasting Shogun. If you've not seen Shogun, you've got to watch Shogun. I have cards and buttons and stuff that'll take you to those YouTube channels. So thanks for the invite, Eric, and nice to be here. Thank you.
My name is Farhia Osman again. I am a doctoral student at Illinois State University. I keep thinking about the fact of needing a professional social media, so I don't really have one to give out. I have my email if you'd like to connect and have more of a chat, especially if it relates to anything that I've been anything you resonate with what I've been talking about for my research. I'd be happy to share any contact information, but don't have anything else besides that.
And my name is Celtic Honey. I do a bunch of different things, like he had briefly touched on. I am one of the cosplay guests for this weekend, so I've done a variety of panels. This is actually the last official panel for today. Everybody's over 18, I think so. The last one that I'm doing will be at 7 p.m. with the Crystal Crown Cabaret. They're doing a panel at 7 o'clock. That is a Nerd Blast show. I have a booth which has all of my merch and prints, and I also have a QR code that you can get to all of my socials. I am on everything. I have I do a lot of transition reels and content like that, and working on tutorials. My specialty is in props and props incorporation and showcasing Kung Fu. And just before heading up here, which is why I was like, oh, it's fine. I just did an avatar panel where I talk about all the different elements behind each style. So there's that, and I do body painting. I do all sizes. I need free time, it's fine. But yeah, come by my booth and let's have a chat. I'll be getting into Carmilla Carmine for the Has-Been photo shoot meetup at 4, and my different booth neighbors on either side of me. We've got a lot of different things going on. And tomorrow I will be in Gambit from X-Men 97, so I'll be in that one, so come by and see me.
Thank you. So, and you can find me at the Department of Psychology at Illinois State University's webpage. You can find me on the both Instagram and X-Twitter. See what I did there? X-Twitter. At Eric Wesselman. I also have a YouTube channel called Digital Golgotha Productions, where I have a variety of videos, nerdy discussions. The Planet FunCon panels will all eventually be up there as well as the previous FunCon panels as well. So thank you again to my esteemed panelists. Thank you all for coming, and please enjoy the rest of your FunCon.